What if the most beautiful palace in Europe was not a symbol of glory, but of sacrifice? Behind the gold of Versailles lay a secret the monarchy never confessed, that purity itself became an offering. Historians whisper of a nameless girl, the last virgin, whose blood was spilled in the name of divine rule. Her story was erased from every record, yet her presence haunted the mirrors for centuries. Tonight, we uncover what the archives tried to bury, a tale of faith, power, and the price of being pure in a world built on sin. Versailles was never merely a palace, it was a performance. Every corridor, every mirrored surface existed to glorify one man, the Sun King, Louis XIV. Yet beneath the perfume, lace, and silken rituals, there lingered an invisible rot. Power had replaced morality. The court was a theater of desire where beauty and obedience were the currency of survival. To serve the king was to surrender the self. To displease him was to vanish without trace. Among the hundreds of attendants brought to this glittering fortress, one stood apart, a girl whose name history refused to preserve. She was barely 16 when chosen to serve in the royal household, a daughter of impoverished nobility offered as a gesture of loyalty. The king's ministers called her pure, the priests called her blessed, and the courtiers called her useful. She arrived believing she had entered the heart of civilization. Instead, she stepped into a perfumed prison. Life at Versailles followed a rhythm both divine and cruel. The rising of the king at dawn was treated as a sacred ceremony. Courtiers fought for the honor of handing him a sleeve or holding a candle. Every gesture was ritual, every glance a calculation. The Virgin, as she would later be remembered, was trained to smile without speaking, to move without sound, and to obey without question. She was clothed in white silk and forbidden to look directly at the monarch. Yet purity, in Versailles, was not protection. It was temptation. The king's aging body sought renewal in beauty, and the priests whispered that contact with innocence might cleanse the corruption of sin. Her presence in the palace was not random. She had been selected. Her lineage was untainted, her reputation unsullied, and her silence ensured by her family's dependence on royal favor. Servants spoke of her as a ghost in daylight, a pale figure who moved through the halls as quietly as smoke. Some pitied her, others envied her, but all understood that she was being watched. The royal physician observed her health, the confessor her faith, and the chambermaids her purity. She belonged to the king before he had ever touched her. The air of Versailles was heavy with contradictions, incense and gossip, prayer and lust, power and shame. While the Virgin polished silver and folded linen in the queen's chambers, men twice her age debated her destiny. Rumors spread that she was to be offered as a living charm, a human vessel through which the king might reclaim his fading vitality. The queen pretended not to hear. The church blessed the silence. Every night, the girl prayed before a small wooden crucifix, begging that her service remain honorable. But faith could not shield her from design. Outside her window, torches flickered along the gardens, 1,000 lights reflecting off the lake, like candles in an unending vigil. Versailles glittered as if heaven itself had descended to earth. And yet, in that glow, purity was already dying. By the spring of 1682, Versailles had become a paradise of corruption. Roses bloomed where blood had once been spilled for construction, and perfumed courtiers wandered through the king's gardens pretending that their world would never decay. Yet beneath the fragrance and music, a strange truth festered. Pleasure had become policy. Morality had been redefined by proximity to power. The Virgin's duties expanded with the season. No longer confined to the queen's quiet chambers, she was summoned to the Jardin du Roi, the king's private retreat where only select guests were permitted. The garden was a masterpiece of order and symmetry, its perfection mirroring the king's desire for control over both nature and men. Every hedge trimmed, every fountain measured, even beauty bowed to authority. There, among marble nymphs and whispering fountains, the Virgin served at the king's banquets. She moved like a spirit among nobles painted with powder and sweat, her innocence a spectacle more intoxicating than wine. The courtiers spoke of her purity as though it were an artifact, a thing to be admired but never respected. Some said she resembled an angel fallen into the court's earthly paradise. Others whispered she was a talisman against the king's growing infirmities. Louis XIV, though still formidable, was aging. His body, once celebrated for vigor, now betrayed him with pain and infection. The doctors prescribed leeches, prayers, and silence, but it was the priests who offered the strangest remedy. They reminded him that purity could cleanse corruption, that proximity to holiness could restore the divine within his mortal shell. Thus began the unspoken superstition that would doom the girl, the belief that a virgin's nearness could heal a king. At first, her service seemed harmless. She attended feasts and ceremonies, standing beside the queen's dais, her eyes lowered. But with each passing day, the distance between her and the Sun King narrowed. The courtiers noticed the glances, the silences, the lingering blessings after Mass. The queen withdrew into prayer, understanding too late that devotion could not compete with divinity manufactured by human hands. The Church, ever complicit, blessed the arrangement through omission. Confessors were instructed to silence scandal. Bishops feigned ignorance. The Virgin's every movement became a spiritual experiment. How near could purity approach sin before it perished? Priests invoked scripture to justify desire, claiming that God himself might act through the king's will. The girl's existence became theology. In the garden, where artifice masked decay, she began to sense her own transformation. Servants addressed her differently. Men who once ignored her now bowed with rehearsed reverence. The same voices that praised her chastity began to discuss her flesh. Each smile, each compliment, carried the weight of prophecy. She was being prepared, not for ceremony but for offering. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she overheard two courtiers speak. "The king will be renewed," one said, "through the touch of purity." The words were not cruel, merely certain. In Versailles, certainty was more dangerous than hatred. That night, the Virgin knelt in the palace chapel, her hands trembling upon the marble rail. She prayed not for salvation, but for understanding. How could sin wear the face of holiness? Why did her purity inspire such hunger? Outside, the fountains roared like captive beasts, drowning her whispered plea. Versailles glowed in the dusk, its beauty absolute and pitiless. Among the roses and statues, the line between worship and desire vanished forever. The king's garden had become his altar, and on that altar, purity waited to be consumed. The chapel of Versailles was the most deceptive sanctuary in France. Beneath its painted ceilings and columns of white marble, sign was confessed, cleansed, and then quietly repeated. It was here that the Virgin first met Father Guillaume, the man who would hear her soul and betray it in the same breath. Guillaume was not a cruel man by nature. He was born to poverty and raised by the Jesuits, a scholar of theology who believed the king's court to be the very heart of divine order. To serve at Versailles was to serve God, or so he had been taught. When he first saw the Virgin kneeling at confession, her pale hands trembling against the wood, he mistook her fear for humility. He did not yet know that her innocence had already been sold. Their meetings followed ritual precision. The confessional was dim, perfumed by incense and wax. She spoke softly, her words careful but honest. At first, she confessed only trivial sins, a moment of envy, a failure of patience, the vanity of looking too long into a mirror. Guillaume listened with a priest's practiced calm, offering gentle absolution. Yet with each visit, her tone shifted. Her questions grew heavier, her pauses longer. She began to speak of things she did not understand, the glances of the king, the strange words of the courtiers, the way others watched her as if waiting for something to happen. Guillaume should have comforted her. Instead, he reported every word to his superior. Within the gilded hierarchy of Versailles, even confessions were instruments of control. The priests were bound to the throne as tightly as the courtiers, their loyalty purchased not by faith but by survival. The confessor's duty was not to the soul, but to the king's security. And so, her private fears became state intelligence. In his reports, Guillaume described her as devout, obedient, and unaware of her impending sanctification. The term was his superior's, a euphemism for ritual exploitation. Somewhere between theology and superstition, the church had learned to baptize cruelty. If the king's health improved through an act of purity, it would be called a miracle. If it failed, the girl would be quietly replaced. The Virgin continued to visit the confessional, unaware that her every word traveled beyond the curtain. Her questions deepened. "Father, can obedience itself be a sin? If one's purity is used for another's gain, does it remain pure?" Guillaume hesitated before answering, torn between conscience and command. He told her that submission to divine authority was the highest form of virtue. It was the first lie he ever told in God's name. As weeks passed, guilt began to hollow him. He dreamt of her face, not as temptation, but as accusation. He saw the reflection of his own cowardice in her eyes, the mirror of all who served power under the illusion of faith. Yet still he obeyed. His pen recorded her confessions each night in neat Latin script, sealed with wax, and sent to the Archbishop's secretary. One evening, as rain lashed against the chapel windows, she whispered, "Father, they are preparing something. I hear them speak of sacrifice." He asked who they were, but she only wept. He promised protection, but both knew it was a hollow word. When she left, Guillaume remained in the dark, staring at the flickering candle that lit his booth. He knew the church had made him both witness and accomplice. He had turned confession, the one place of truth, into a weapon. And in that silence, the Virgin's innocence ceased to belong to God. It belonged to the system that used his name to sanctify sin. By the winter of 1683, the Sun King's glow had begun to dim. The court physicians whispered of fevers that returned like ghosts, of unhealed sores, of exhaustion that no luxury could cure. Versailles, so radiant by candlelight, had become a house of sickness. The king's body, once the emblem of divine strength, was now a map of decay. And as the monarch's vitality waned, desperation birthed new superstitions. Medicine in France, though adorned with Latin phrases and royal funding, was ruled more by myth than science. The learned men of the court believed purity possessed curative power. Among the old texts stored in the royal library, physicians found writings that spoke of the sanguis virginalis, virgin's blood, as the purest essence of life. It was said to hold celestial harmony, capable of restoring a ruler's strength if taken with prayer and faith. The church dismissed such practices in public, yet behind closed doors, it sanctioned them under another name, divine remedy. The Virgin, fragile and silent, was unknowingly placed at the center of this grim philosophy. Her body, once regarded as sacred for its chastity, was now valued for its supposed medicinal virtue. Servants began to monitor her food, her health, her sleep. The royal physician ordered that she be given only blessed water and bread, as though purification could be measured through diet. Each day she grew paler, thinner, more ethereal, a symbol of sanctity carved into suffering flesh. Rumors spread through the palace corridors like fever. Some said the king would drink a drop of her blood during Mass, mixed with consecrated wine. Others whispered that her flesh would be pricked, and the crimson sealed in reliquaries beside the chapel altar. The boundaries between medicine, magic, and faith had dissolved completely. Versailles was inventing its own religion, one in which the king's salvation demanded the Virgin's pain. The queen, devout yet powerless, retreated into prayer. She had seen too many miracles orchestrated by fear to protest openly. When she attempted to question the ritual, she was told that obedience to divine will required silence. The priests assured her it was symbolic, that no harm would come. But symbolism at Versailles had a way of consuming reality. One evening, as the king's fever worsened, the Virgin was summoned to the royal chapel. Candles lined the marble floor, and incense clouded the air thick with holiness and dread. The physician stood beside the altar, a silver instrument gleaming in his hand. The confessor prayed aloud for the merging of purity and power. No one spoke the word blood, yet everyone understood. When it was over, the Virgin was returned to her chamber, her wrist bandaged in silk. She told no one what had happened. The king recovered briefly in the following days, enough to proclaim gratitude for God's mercy. The court celebrated, unaware or unwilling to see that the mercy had been bought with flesh. Within weeks, his strength faded again. The ritual, now believed effective, was repeated in secrecy. Each act took more of her essence, more of her humanity. And as the king's physicians argued over doses and doctrines, the Virgin learned the true nature of devotion. Versailles had always demanded sacrifice. But this time, the offering was not symbolic. It was living. And with every drop spilled in the name of faith, the Sun King's light grew darker, fed by the blood of the innocent. The year 1685 marked a turning point in Versailles, the year when superstition and sin finally merged into ritual. The king's illness, though hidden behind velvet curtains, was now common knowledge among courtiers. Fear of divine punishment spread through the palace like smoke, twisting faith into frenzy. The affair of the poisons, once a whisper among servants, erupted into the very heart of the royal household. What began as rumors of enchanted powders and forbidden charms soon became a witch hunt draped in silk. Dozens of nobles, alchemists, and self-proclaimed sorcerers were accused of trafficking with the devil. They were said to sell poisons disguised as perfumes, and blessings brewed with human remains. In truth, most were guilty only of ambition, but in a court that worshipped beauty, even death had to be elegant. The Virgin was drawn into this darkness without understanding it. Her name appeared in testimonies from the prisoners of the Chambre Ardente, the secret tribunal created by the king to investigate witchcraft among the elite. A condemned maidservant spoke of a white girl of divine scent, whose blood was used in nocturnal masses intended to cleanse the monarch's soul. The words were dismissed publicly, yet privately they echoed in the corridors where priests and alchemists met by candlelight. Among these shadowed figures was Antoine de la Reynie, the chief investigator who understood that the king's own healers might be guilty of crimes worse than poison. He recorded strange rituals involving herbs, incantations, and a drop of virgin's essence. Though no names were written, the implication was clear. Behind the grand facade of Versailles, piety had become theater, and the sacred had been rewritten as science. The court responded with denial. Publicly, the king ordered executions of those found guilty of witchcraft, their ashes scattered as a warning. But privately, he preserved the very practices he condemned. His fear of death outweighed his fear of sin. Each night, as the fires of the poisoners' trials burned outside Paris, the king's own chamber glowed with the light of candles set for another ritual. The Virgin was summoned once more under the guise of prayer. The alchemists spoke softly, their Latin phrases cloaking terror and reverence. She was made to kneel before a basin of silver water, her reflection trembling beneath the surface. A few drops of her blood were mixed into the bowl, stirred with consecrated gold. The mixture was lifted to the king's lips as a token of celestial renewal. He drank, and the room fell into holy silence. No one clapped. No one dared breathe. Then the king sighed, relief or guilt, none could tell. The ceremony ended as quietly as it began, sealed by fear. In the days that followed, several of the king's closest attendants died suddenly, convulsions, blackened tongues, the scent of burnt almonds lingering in their rooms. The court blamed poison, but no poison was found. Only the Virgin seemed untouched, pale and silent as ever, her eyes hollow from prayers unanswered. Some began to believe she carried divine protection. Others suspected she was the source of the curse. The trials continued until the king himself ordered them halted. Too many names had been spoken, too many secrets unearthed. Versailles demanded silence more than justice. And so the Feast of the Poisoners ended not with a reckoning, but with a quiet pact. Truth would be buried, and sin would continue to serve as medicine. In the gilded heart of the palace, evil no longer wore horns, it wore a crown. By the summer of 1686, Versailles glimmered like a jewel in the dusk, masking the decay within. The king's body had weakened once again. His physicians whispered of tumors, ulcers, and a creeping blackness that no poultice could cure. The blood rituals that once promised salvation had lost their power. The Virgin remained alive, but frail, her presence now a haunting reminder that purity, once consumed, could not be reborn. It was then that the court's obsession with sanctified pain reached its most obscene expression. The royal confessor declared that the king's suffering was divine punishment, and that redemption required an act of purification equal in sacrifice to sin itself. The idea spread among priests and physicians alike. If the king's impurity had defiled his body, only the complete merging of purity and corruption could restore balance. What began as whispered theology soon became royal decree. Preparations were made in secret. The queen was told it was a ceremony of renewal, a spiritual rite to bless the monarch's body. She was instructed not to attend, her presence unfit for divine reconciliation. Servants were dismissed. Curtains drawn, candles lit, the Virgin, dressed in bridal white, was led into the king's chamber. She was told it was an honor, that her virtue would save France. She did not resist. She simply trembled. The bed was adorned with roses, the same flowers used in holy processions. Their scent was overwhelming, sweet, almost nauseating. Beneath them, unseen by her eyes, the sheets were lined with silver blades, their edges dulled but sharp enough to pierce. Each petal hid a symbol of pain, each prayer a disguise for cruelty. The king lay motionless, his breath shallow. Priests murmured litanies, invoking saints who had once died for faith. The confessor spoke of divine union, of innocence offering itself to authority as Christ offered himself to the Father. The Virgin knelt, believing she was to pray. But when her hands were placed upon the king's chest, the ritual turned. The candles dimmed. The priests withdrew. What followed was not divine but human. An act stripped of sanctity, performed under the shadow of God's name. The roses were crushed, the silver bit into flesh, and the prayer turned to silence. When it ended, the king wept not from remorse, but from relief. He had taken purity and called it healing. Versailles would call it redemption. The Virgin was carried away, unconscious but alive. Her gown, once white, now bore stains no water could cleanse. The confessor, pale and shaking, recorded the event in coded Latin as Ritus Renovationis Corporis Regis, the rite of renewal of the king's body. The entry was sealed, never to be spoken of again. In the following days, the king's health improved briefly. The court celebrated with fireworks, unaware that the Virgin lay in a locked chamber, feverish and broken. The queen asked to see her but was denied. The priests claimed she was undergoing spiritual recovery. In truth, she could no longer speak. Outside, the roses of Versailles continued to bloom, watered by servants who knew nothing of what had been done in their name. Yet every evening, the scent of them seemed sharper, a sweetness that hid decay. The bed of roses had become an altar of knives. And within that perfumed silence, France had traded its soul for a few more breaths of a dying king. The morning after the secret rite, Versailles awakened as though nothing had happened. Music echoed through the halls, courtiers rehearsed smiles, and the fountains danced beneath the rising sun. Yet beneath that radiant surface, a silence deeper than death had settled. The Virgin was gone from public sight, and no one dared to ask why. The Queen attended Mass in the palace chapel that morning. The King knelt beside her, serene, as if absolved. The confessor, pale and exhausted, delivered a sermon so carefully measured that each word felt carved from fear. He spoke of the virtues of obedience, of sacrifice, and of the divine right of kings. He did not mention the Virgin, yet every listener felt her absence pressing against the air like an unspoken curse. Versailles understood silence as survival. Servants who had glimpsed the preparations of the previous night were dismissed or reassigned. The chambermaids who had washed the sheets were instructed never to speak of them again. Even the Queen's ladies, loyal to their mistress, pretended ignorance. The only evidence of what had occurred was a faint smell of roses and blood that lingered in the corridor. Outside the King's bedroom, a scent so subtle that it could be mistaken for perfume. That afternoon, under orders from the royal confessor, a bundle of white silk was carried to the garden furnace behind the chapel. It contained the Virgin's gown, torn and stained. The fire was fed with incense and cedar, the flames rising high enough to touch the marble walls. The priest overseeing the burning whispered a psalm for the purification of the house. The irony was lost on no one. Meanwhile, the King received ambassadors, his complexion improved and his mood triumphant. To the world, he appeared reborn, the living emblem of divine favor. Yet within the palace, his rejuvenation inspired unease rather than joy. Some claimed to hear weeping in the walls during Mass, others that the mirrors in the Hall of Glory dimmed when he passed. The Virgin's disappearance had become a ghost story whispered by candlelight, a superstition that servants dared not repeat in daylight. Father Diem, tormented by guilt, tried once to confess his own role in the affair. His superior silenced him with a single phrase, "The King's sins are not yours to question." The church that had once sanctified confession now demanded secrecy. The Virgin's name was erased from every ledger. Her existence reduced to a note in the confessor's private journal, a single line that read, "The offering is complete." Weeks later, during Sunday Mass, the King ordered a special sermon of thanksgiving for divine restoration. The chapel filled with courtiers dressed in white, their jewels flashing beneath the stained glass. The air was thick with incense, yet even that sacred smoke could not hide the unease that rippled through the crowd. The confessor's voice trembled as he preached about the harmony between heaven and the throne. Each word struck the listeners like a blade disguised as prayer. As the final hymn ended, the King rose, his gaze distant, almost haunted. For a moment, the sunlight through the stained glass fell upon his hands, and on the faint red mark that no amount of holy water could erase. Outside, the bells of Versailles tolled for morning prayer, their sound echoing through gardens that no longer felt alive. The Virgin's silence had become the court's salvation and its curse. After the Virgin's disappearance, the Queen began to wither beneath her powdered grace. Her skin paled, her breath grew shallow, and her sleep was broken by the echo of unseen footsteps. Physicians whispered that her illness was of the spirit, not the flesh, a punishment or a haunting. But in Versailles, even suffering was disguised as ceremony. The Queen's confessor sought aid from a man the court called the philosopher of shadows, Antoine de Versailles, an alchemist once employed by the royal apothecary. He had been dismissed years earlier for unorthodox experiments, yet his name survived in secret among those who trafficked in poisons, perfumes, and cures that blurred the line between medicine and witchcraft. Now he was summoned in silence, brought through the servants' corridor at midnight, his arrival concealed from public record. Versailles was no ordinary charlatan. He had studied the forbidden chemistry of the ancients, Paracelsus, Agrippa, and Al-Razi, believing that purity of the body could be transmuted into purity of soul. His chamber in the Queen's wing soon filled with flasks of mercury, amber, and dried hearts preserved in vinegar. The air reeked of sulfur and decay, yet within that filth he promised salvation. The queen, desperate and broken, allowed him to perform his rituals. He anointed her wrists with oils distilled from rose petals and the ashes of white doves. He whispered prayers in Latin, invoking celestial harmony, but the scent made her faint. When she awoke, she claimed to see a shadow at the edge of her vision, a woman with blood on her lips, weeping behind a veil of silk. Rumors spread quickly. Servants spoke of screams muffled behind the alchemist's door, of glass shattering in the night, of voices reciting scripture backward. One maid swore she saw the alchemist pouring a vial of red liquid into the queen's bath, muttering that life renews through blood. The king dismissed the rumors as hysteria, but his visits to the queen ceased altogether. Within weeks, the queen's chamber became a shrine of contradictions, lace curtains fluttering beside cages of dying birds, a crucifix placed above a table littered with jars of unholy ingredients. The priests were forbidden entry. Only Versailles and a mute servant remained within. Those who glimpsed him afterward said he no longer blinked, that his pupils had turned the color of tarnished gold. By the end of that winter, the queen's health did not improve. Her hair thinned, her voice cracked, and her reflection seemed to fade. Yet Versailles insisted she was transforming, not dying. When questioned by the royal confessor, he answered calmly, "The body resists divinity before it surrenders." His words terrified even the most devout. One stormy night, the alchemist's chamber caught fire. Guards broke down the door and found him kneeling in the flames, cradling something wrapped in silk. Inside the bundle was a charred mask, identical to the one worn by the Virgin on the night of her offering. The queen was found unconscious, her face pale as marble. When she awoke, she remembered nothing. Versailles' remains were never recovered. The king ordered all mention of him erased from the royal records. Yet some claim to hear his footsteps echoing in the queen's wing for years afterward, a faint metallic rhythm like glass dripping onto stone. The queen's illness vanished soon after, but her soul did not. Her laughter grew hollow, her eyes empty, as if she had been cured only by losing what was human within her. The alchemist had promised purification. Versailles received possession instead. Time softened the edges of the scandal, but never erased its shadow. Years passed. Kings aged. Courtiers died or were replaced. Yet the walls of Versailles, carved, polished, and gilded, remembered everything. In the Hall of Mirrors, the light still moved strangely, as if reluctant to settle. Visitors spoke of whispers when the chamber stood empty, a breath that did not belong to the living. The king, now older and heavier, had grown devout in appearance, but not in peace. Every morning he walked through the mirrored hall to attend mass, his reflection following like 1,000 ghosts. At times he paused, convinced that one face among the 1,000 did not move when he did. A pale girl in white, eyes downcast, her image faint but undeniable. At first, the court dismissed the talk as the imagination of servants. But whispers grew persistent. Gardeners crossing the terrace before dawn claimed to see a figure gliding inside the hall. Chambermaids swore the mirrors clouded when they passed, as though the glass itself exhaled. Priests were summoned to bless the room. Holy water dripped down the frames, leaving streaks like tears across the glass, but the unease remained. In 1704, a visiting duchess recorded in her diary, "There is a silence here that breathes." The mirrors hum faintly, as though the walls have lungs. The phrase circulated in secret among the courtiers, who avoided the hall after dark. Even musicians refused to rehearse near it, claiming their instruments fell out of tune when they approached the mirrored doors. The queen, withdrawn and spectral, never entered that hall again. She prayed instead in her private chapel, lit only by a single candle. Her attendants often found her whispering apologies to someone who was not there. On certain nights, she ordered the curtains drawn, declaring that the moonlight made the mirrors remember. After the king's death, the new courtiers tried to reclaim the hall's splendor. The mirrors were repolished, the chandeliers renewed. Yet the restorers, working in silence, noticed their reflections waver. Some said the girl's image appeared clearer than before, standing behind them, watching with calm pity. One worker fled, babbling about a handprint of frost that appeared inside the glass where no hand could reach. Records from the palace archives mention discreet exorcisms conducted under royal approval between 1710 and 1722. The church refused to explain their cause, noting only manifestations incompatible with Christian peace. Each ceremony ended the same way, the priests departing pale, the mirrors gleaming brighter than before, as though polished by invisible hands. By mid-century, the legend of La Jeune Vierge du Miroir, the Maiden of the Mirror, had spread beyond Versailles. Poets invoked her in melancholic verses. Skeptics mocked her as superstition. Yet travelers continued to report the same vision. A veiled woman reflected in glass corridors, moving one step behind reality. When lightning struck the Hall of Mirrors during a storm in 1783, shattering several panels, restorers found something strange behind the broken glass. Small fragments of silk fused to the back of the mirror. Crimson turned dark with age. The discovery was never publicized. The fragments were sealed in a wooden reliquary and stored deep in the palace archives. Even now, historians who study the Versailles blueprints note an anomaly. One panel in the Hall of Mirrors, narrower than the rest, never replaced after the storm. When light passes over it at dawn, it seems to flicker, as if something within still tries to speak. The mirrors of Versailles reflect the living, but they remember the dead. For more than a century, Versailles kept its secrets sealed behind gold and etiquette. But time corrodes even marble. In the summer of 1778, during minor renovations near the Queen's old apartments, a workman discovered a narrow, dust-choked chamber walled off behind a false panel. The air was stale, the walls mottled with mold. Yet within that forgotten room rested a small writing desk, a candlestick burned to its base, and a single leather-bound book. The book was wrapped in what appeared to be aged silk, once white, now faded to a sickly gray. Across its cover, in faint ink, was written only one word: submission. Submission. The pages inside were brittle, stained with moisture and something darker. The handwriting belonged to a woman, delicate, careful, and trembling. At first, the archivists assumed it was a devotional diary, the kind kept by ladies in waiting. But as the words were read aloud, silence fell over the room. It was not a prayer book. It was a confession. The entries began with gratitude toward the Queen, describing service in the royal household. But soon, the tone shifted. The unnamed writer spoke of fear, of being chosen for a sacred experiment. She described a night filled with music and incense, of being dressed in white silk and led through corridors she did not recognize. Her writing trembled with confusion, obedience laced with terror. She wrote of the king's illness, the priest's words about sacrifice, and the burning of rose petals mixed with blood. "I was told," one line read, "that the purity of one may restore the spirit of another. But what of the soul that is taken? Where does it go?" As the entries continued, her faith fractured. She began addressing her words not to the Queen or her confessor, but directly to God. "If I am thy offering," she wrote, "let my suffering be known, even if no man dares to remember it." The ink grew more frantic near the end. Her sentences shorter, her spelling erratic. The final pages were spattered, perhaps with ink, perhaps not. The last entry read, "The chamber smells of roses. They say it is a holy night. I no longer believe holiness can bleed." The discovery was reported quietly to the archivist of the crown. Within days, soldiers arrived and sealed the chamber. The journal was taken to a secure archive. Recorded only as document 31V, the men involved were instructed to sign an oath of silence under threat of imprisonment. Yet one copy was made. A scribe, horrified by what he had read, secretly transcribed the journal's key passages and hid them within the binding of a personal Bible. His descendants would later claim that this Bible resurfaced during the Revolution. Modern historians who have examined references to document 31V describe its prose as a perfect synthesis of devotion and despair. Some interpret it as metaphor, a servant's madness born of religious delusion. Others, however, recognize it as evidence of something darker, a ritual sanctioned not by sorcery, but by power. The Virgin's voice, preserved in trembling ink, had finally escaped the silence of Versailles. She had not cursed her captors. She had not demanded revenge. Her final prayer was simpler, that the truth would not die where she did. When the last archivist to handle the original journal died in 1792, his notes contained one final remark: "The ink is dry." Yet the page remains damp to the touch. The walls that had silenced her once now seemed to weep. When the Bastille fell in the summer of 1789, it was not only the prison walls that cracked, it was the silence of a kingdom. The revolution swept through France like divine retribution, tearing apart the illusions of sanctity that had shielded the monarchy for centuries. Priests fled, nobles vanished, and archives long sealed under royal order were pried open by hands trembling with hunger and vengeance. Among those archives was a locked iron chest discovered beneath the chapel of Versailles. Inside, revolutionaries found bundles of decaying documents, confessional letters, the correspondence of royal confessors, and a set of journals marked with the fleur-de-lis. One folder bore a faint inscription: "Fil du sang-pur, 1682, the same phrase that would later haunt historians, daughter of the pure blood. Within those papers lay fragments of a story the court had buried beneath perfume and prayer. Among the brittle pages were copies of the Virgin's journal, accounts of the secret mass, and the alchemist's final notes on divine transference. The revolutionaries, untrained in theology but fluent in rage, read them aloud by candlelight. What they found was not myth, it was evidence of the monarchy's moral rot. They learned that the king, hailed for his divine right, had sanctioned a ritual of purity and blood to restore his strength. That priests, sworn to mercy, had transformed scripture into a tool of cruelty. That an innocent girl had been offered, body and soul, to sustain a throne. The Virgin's suffering, once confined to whispers and superstition, now echoed in the streets. The documents spread through Paris like wildfire. Revolutionary pamphleteers reprinted excerpts under new titles: "The Sin of Kings," "The Blood of the Innocent," "Confession of Versailles." Whether or not the texts were authentic mattered little, their symbolism was absolute. To the starving masses, the story of the Virgin was not just a tale of one girl. It was the story of France itself, bled dry for the pleasure of its rulers. In October 1789, when the mob marched to Versailles to bring the royal family to Paris, some shouted the Virgin's name without knowing it. "For the pure one," they cried, holding torches that reflected off the same mirrors where her image was once seen. The palace, drenched in history and fear, stood silent as the crowd tore down its gates. Inside, in the Queen's private chapel, a revolutionary soldier recorded a curious sight: a faint crimson stain on the marble floor beneath the altar, shaped. He wrote, like a hand turned upward. He dismissed it as rust. Yet he could not forget it. Years later, when the terror consumed its own children, he claimed in his prison diary that Versailles still breathes, and the dead have their vengeance. The Virgin's voice had become France's conscience. Her journal, read aloud in secret gatherings, was treated as prophecy. Even Robespierre, the cold apostle of virtue, quoted from it in his notes. Purity is never preserved by blood, it is destroyed by it. The monarchy fell not only to swords and hunger, but to memory, the unburied guilt of a nation that had sanctified cruelty as divine order. When the last royal confessor was executed, witnesses said he murmured a single phrase before the blade fell. She was the beginning. And so the revolution became her confession, written not in ink, but in blood. Today, visitors wander through the glittering halls of Versailles, their footsteps softened by velvet ropes and reverent whispers. The mirrors shine, the chandeliers burn bright, and the air smells of polish and roses. But beneath that splendor lies something colder, an unease the guides never mention. For behind certain locked doors, in rooms not listed on any map, the past has been carefully preserved, sealed in silence. Deep within the archives of the palace, past corridors of portraits and dust, lies a narrow chamber known to only a handful of historians. Inside it, temperature-controlled cabinets guard relics deemed too fragile or too dangerous to display. Among them rests an unmarked box of faded oak, bound with iron clasps. Its catalog entry bears no title, only a code. FSP 1682. Those who have seen it say the initials stand for Feel. Du sang pur, daughter of the pure blood. The box contains little at first glance: fragments of silk, a broken crucifix, a charred mask, and a single journal wrapped in protective linen. Yet the weight of it, the silence it commands, is unmistakable. The ink has bled into the parchment like a wound that never closed. On the final page, one line remains legible: "May the dawn remember." Curators who handle the archive speak in low voices, aware of something intangible that lingers near the collection. Some describe a faint scent of roses that emerges when the box is opened, others the sound of distant footsteps echoing where no corridor exists. A few refuse to enter the room alone. Officially, these reports are dismissed as imagination, the residue of history on sensitive minds. Unofficially, the staff call it La Salle du Silence, the Room of Silence. Every decade, scholars petition to study the sealed files of Versailles' spiritual court, records that could confirm the Virgin's existence, or at least the ritual that ended her life. Each request is denied. The Church claims the documents were lost in the Revolution. The state insists they were destroyed in a fire. But both know the truth is not gone, merely sleeping. At dawn, when sunlight breaks across the palace, the Hall of Mirrors glows with an otherworldly warmth. Guides attribute it to reflection, the perfect alignment of glass and light. Yet those who arrive early, before the first tour begins, sometimes notice something different: the faint hue of red that blooms across the marble floor, visible only for a moment before it fades. Cameras never capture it. Eyes do. Modern historians have tried to explain away the legend: contamination of materials, tricks of light, or coincidence. But legends, like wounds, persist because something real once bled beneath them. The Virgin's story, erased from scripture and law, survives not through faith, but through memory. Her silence shaped the conscience of a nation. Her suffering became the measure of its lost divinity. Versailles remains a monument to beauty, but beneath that beauty lies confession. Every reflection, every note of music, carries an echo of those who suffered unseen so that others could appear eternal. In the museum gift shop, visitors can buy replicas of the red veil, now marketed as a symbol of passion. None suspect it was once the mark of a sacrifice. And yet, when the sun sets and the palace empties, a faint glow lingers on the mirrors, as if remembering what they once reflected. The blood pact of Versailles was never broken. It merely learned to hide behind glass.